Rule number 3 deals with the attributes. Rule number 2 dealt with the names. Every name implies an attribute, but not every attribute has a name. It may imply a name, but we don't create names from attributes. Names are established by revelation, not by reason, because to create names from attributes, that involves reason. We're reasoning out. Allah didn't call himself that, but we're going to call him that, because this is one of his attributes. We don't go there. Allah called himself that. It has along with it a particular attribute. We accept it, because language requires that names have attributes, and when we use those names, we mean the attribute. This also has 4 subcategories. No. We did rule number 2. We have subcategory. We did 4 subcategories. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now we're going on to rule number 3, which also has 4 subcategories. The basic rule is, the basic rule deals with, we're not given the rule, we're going to look at the subcategories, but the rule deals with Allah's attributes. The second rule dealt with Allah's names. Right? Before we spoke about names and attributes together. It was a general rule. Rule number 1 was a general rule concerning Allah's names and attributes. How do we deal with them in the text of the Quran and the Sunnah? General. Now we're going specific down to the names. What are the rules concerning the names? And what are the rules concerning the attributes? There's some overlapping. Some approach to the names and attributes are going to be the same, whether you talk about names or you're talking about attributes. But then there's some which are specific to attributes, which are not to names, and some which are specific to names and not to attributes in and of themselves. Because as we said, not every attribute has a name associated with it, though every name has an attribute associated with it. Right? So we have a general and a specific category. So, under rule number 3, dealing with the attributes, the first subcategory, all of Allah's attributes are transcendent. Attributes of perfection and praise, without any deficiency in any respect. This is similar to subcategory number 1 with regards to Allah's names. That is, all Allah's names are beautiful. They're free from any defect. So similarly, in terms of the attributes, whether it is life, knowledge, hearing, sight, etc., wisdom, transcendence, all of these are free from any deficiency. They're perfect, because Allah is Himself perfect. And Allah said in Surah Nahl, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, and to Allah belongs the supreme example. To Allah belongs the supreme example. When you're talking about an attribute, this is an example that you're giving of Allah, about Allah. Right? You're describing Him in terms. When you give an example, we're describing something. We want to tell you how this thing is. So we're talking about its attributes. So when Allah said that the supreme example belongs to Allah, this is only what is attributable to Him. So what we're saying then is that attributes should only be in their perfection. If an attribute represents deficiency, without any element of perfection, it is absolutely inapplicable to Allah. If an attribute, because it's the opposite side, on one hand we said the attributes must contain perfection, rejecting any deficiency that might be associated with it when applied to human beings. Okay? On the other hand, any attribute which contains deficiency without any element of perfection, this is inapplicable to Allah. For example, can we think of an attribute associated with human beings? Because that's really what we're going to, right? Or creatures, an attribute associated with them, which is purely deficient, which has no element of perfection in it at all. Huh? Tiredness, forgetfulness, huh? Cruelty, yeah. Huh? Sleep, death. Go to death. It's deficiency. There's no perfection in death. Birth. It's deficiency. I mean, deficiency doesn't necessarily mean it's evil, but it's just deficiency. Deficiency meaning that it is not perfect. Birth for human beings is a good thing. It's not an evil thing, it's a good thing. But it implies in it deficiency. You cannot establish perfection with birth. Perfection is having no beginning. That's perfection. Having a beginning is imperfection. Because to have a beginning, you need someone to cause you to begin. So you're imperfect. You don't have control over everything. There's others more powerful than you that can bring you into existence. So that's why we reject, Jesus, for example, as God, because according to teachings of Christians that he died. Of course, we don't believe he died anyway. But he was born. Take that one. On the 8th day, he was circumcised. These are all deficiencies. It's not perfection. Because perfection means you don't change. Change implies imperfection. That you have to change, you yourself. Right? So once God himself changes, then he's not a perfect God anymore. Okay, to catch the salah, we'll break here. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بالسنة إلى يوم الدين. All praise due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. In the previous class, we were looking at the third, or is it the third? Okay, Allah's names and attributes. We're looking at the subcategories, right? The first, which we defined as being similar to the description or the rule concerning Allah's names. Right? That's why I said there was going to be some overlapping, because they share some basic link. Names, we said, imply attributes, but they differ in that though names imply attributes which we must accept, attributes may imply names which we don't accept. Right? That's the point, right? So we spoke about the basic principle that the names or attributes should not have any deficiency or weakness or lack associated with them. And we said that any name which implies weakness and doesn't have any perfect element to it is completely inapplicable to Allah. We gave examples of deaf, deafness, we could add blindness, etc. If the attribute represents perfection from one aspect and imperfection from another, and there are two elements to it, and that's usually when attributed to Allah's creatures, such an attribute is not affirmed or rejected absolutely. Such an attribute is not affirmed or rejected absolutely. Meaning that the perfect aspect of the attribute is accepted because that is applicable to Allah, and the imperfect attribute, where there is imperfection, that is rejected, and we don't apply that to Allah. An example of that can be seen in the attribute of plotting. To plot. When people plot, usually we think of it in a kind of a bad way. You're plotting to do this or plotting to do that. Now in Surah Al-Anfal, verse 30, Allah says, وَيَمْكُرُونَ وَيَمْكُرُ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. They plot and Allah plots, and Allah is the best of plotters. In Surah Tariq, verses 15 and 16, إِنَّهُمْ يَكِيدُونَ كَيْدًا وَأَكِيدُ كَيْدًا. Indeed, they scheme and I scheme. Scheming we usually associate with negativity. إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ يُخَادِعُونَ اللَّهَ وَهُوَ خَادِعُهُم. Surely the hypocrites try to deceive Allah, but it is He who deceives them. Deception. Right? So if somebody said to you, can we describe Allah as plotting? Can we describe Him as scheming and as deceiving? What do you say?
His way of plotting is different. It's not the evil way that man...
But can we or not?
Yes, because Allah mentions it in the Quran.
Yes. Yeah, we say yes, but not absolutely. We have to qualify it. We say yes, we can describe Allah in these terms because He described Himself in these terms. That's why we can describe Him in those terms. But we have to qualify that the negative elements of it we don't attribute to Allah, and only the positive elements we attribute. Because if somebody can plot and you can't outplot them, what does that imply? It implies weakness on your part. If they can scheme and you can't out-scheme them, then again, if they can fool you and you can't out-fool them, then it implies deficiency on your part. So, that element of perfection in that, nobody can out-fool Allah, can out-deceive Him, can out-scheme Him, or can out-plot Him. That element, we affirm that Allah can outdo anybody. But the negative aspects of plotting, scheming, and deceiving, this we don't attribute to Allah. This is to human beings, to His creatures, the jinn, whatever. But to Allah we don't apply it. Allah's plotting is His not allowing any of His creatures to outdo Him. His counterplot establishes His supremacy. Allahu Akbar. The counter here establishes His supremacy. That's wherein lies the perfection. That He is supreme. There's nothing greater than Him. No one, none of His creatures is greater. So that being the case, then nothing should be able to scheme against Him and get away. His scheming is countering, not intending evil. He's countering that evil. Right? So, the ability to counter, that is perfection. What is unable to counter is imperfect, is weak. So this is where we affirm these descriptions that Allah has given Himself, but within the context of their perfect element. The second subcategory of attributes involves dividing attributes into positive and negative. Positive attributes and negative attributes. Where Allah describes Himself as so-and-so, that's a positive attribute. Where He says, I'm not so-and-so, that is a negative attribute. Right? Allah always, that's a positive attribute. Allah never, negative attribute. Right? The basic principle concerning these attributes, we can say, is that every positive attribute implies a negative attribute. And every negative attribute implies a positive attribute. So wherever we have a positive attribute, we must affirm that attribute and affirm its negative corollary. And wherever we have a negative attribute, we must affirm that negative attribute and also affirm, or we could say we could deny that attribute. We affirm the negative attribute, or we deny that attribute and affirm the positive opposite. We deny the attribute, which is a negative attribute, and we affirm the positive attribute, the positive opposite. So for example, Allah says, وَلَا يَظْلِمُ رَبُّكَ أَحَدًا, and your Lord does not oppress anyone. So the negative attribute here is lack of oppression. Lack of oppression. That He does not oppress. That is the negative attribute. Oppression is an attribute of deficiency. Oppression is an attribute of deficiency. Right? It is a wrong. So when Allah negates oppression from Himself, that together represents a negative attribute. Allah is not an oppressor. He does not oppress. That is your negative attribute. So what is the positive attribute that you must also affirm while denying oppression from Him? What is the positive attribute that you must affirm, which is its corollary or its opposite?
Allah is just.
It's justice. Oppression is injustice, and the opposite is justice. That Allah is just. So when we deny that He oppresses, we affirm at the same time that He's just. The two are two sides of the same coin. Right?
Like Allah Ghafur Rahim or Shadidul Iqab. Is that the same thing?
Okay, brother gave the example of Allah being Ghafur Rahim, that He is forgiving, and merciful, and at the same time He is Shadidul Iqab, He is severe in punishment. This is not an example of what we're talking about. What we have there are balancing of attributes. That on one hand, He is forgiving, but for those who don't seek His forgiveness, He punishes. And His justice requires that He punishes those who don't seek His forgiveness. Because if those who don't seek His forgiveness are forgiven like those who seek His forgiveness, then where is the justice? There's injustice in it. Okay? So that is just balancing attributes. Both of these attributes represent positive attributes. Shadid al-Iqab, severe in punishment, we would only remove from that punishment which is unjust. Right? Because a person, a human being, he might be severe in punishment, but he's gone beyond the limits. When you say he's severe in his punishments, right, means he just, really takes you to task. He beats you beyond, whatever. So this is not a good quality. It's not a good quality. So that element of it, where it's gone beyond the what is fair and just, we exclude. But shadid, severe in punishment, where it is just, then that is perfection. The third subcategory of Allah's attributes, the rule concerning Allah's attributes, is that the affirmative attributes may also be divided into two other categories: personal and consequential. Personal, in Arabic they call dhatiya, from that, meaning the essence. You could call them essential. And the fi'liya. Fi'liya, consequential, meaning that they have to do with his actions. One describes attributes of himself, not necessarily associated with actions on his creatures, and the other one describes actions with regards to his creatures. So for example, a personal attribute would be like hearing and seeing. That's describing not something that he does to the creatures, but something that describes his essence, that he's able to hear all things and see all things. Whereas the consequential attributes, فعلية, this relates to the attributes which he does sometimes and he doesn't do sometimes. Right? It's not something he may be doing all the time. If he wishes to do it, he does it. If he doesn't wish to do it, he doesn't do it. An example of that would be Allah in the last third of the night coming to the first heaven and listening to and accepting prayers of those who pray at that time because of its special nature. It's something he wishes to do and he does. And it's not necessarily something that he's doing all the time. Some attributes may have both elements to it, like the attribute of speech. The attribute of speech is personal, that he has the ability to speak, which is connected to his essence. It's not something that he learns like a human being. When the child reaches a certain age, it's able to speak. Prior to that, it can't. No. And at the same time, he speaks to the prophets that he chooses to. Prophet Musa. And he doesn't to others, also choosing not to. He's given it as a special character or characteristics to some prophets that he communicated with them. All of Revelation was through his communication, while to others it was through the agency of angels, etc., etc. And to people who are not prophets or messengers, he doesn't speak to directly. Right? The fourth subcategory identified by Sheikh Al-Uthaymeen addresses some issues concerning the attributes themselves in terms of how do we understand them. In terms of how do we understand them. First and foremost, the first issue, and this is under the fourth subcategory, right? First issue is
this another subcategory?
Yeah, I guess you could call it a subcategory. You know, these are issues under the subcategory. Huh? Yeah. There are basically 3 points. The first of the three is, how do we understand the attribute? Literally or figuratively? Actually, that goes back to our original principle that we take the obvious literal meaning of texts first and foremost, unless there is reason to do otherwise. There is good reason. Good reason meaning not just what I feel, what I think. Good reason means there is textual evidence to imply that that meaning is contrary to other texts which consistently describe Allah in another way. Right? So, for example, if we have, as in Surah Al-Qaf, 16th verse, وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ, and I am closer to him than his jugular vein, describing human beings. It's closer to him, closer to the human being than his jugular vein. This implies that Allah is within human beings. That's the implication. Because the jugular vein is inside your body, and to be closer means you have to be even more inside. But what does that imply? If we understand from that Allah is inside each and every one of us, then, as Ibn Arabi had said, no need to worship Allah outside of yourself. Worship Allah who is within you. Or as others like the Hindus say, you may worship other human beings who are God incarnate. God is more concentrated in them than in the average person, though God's in everybody. But in these individuals they call avatars or God-men, God is more concentrated, so you can worship them. So, since the idea of God being in human beings is the basis of idolatry, of worshipping Allah's creatures, we have to therefore say that from a logical perspective, there is a question mark here. But do we have textual evidence to imply otherwise? Well, yes, there are many verses in the Quran where Allah describes Himself as being above His creatures. One of His names is Al-Ali, which means the transcendent, above. Nothing being below Him, above everything. And we find in Surah An-Nahl verse 50, Allah saying there, describing the believers, يَخَافُونَ رَبَّهُمْ يخافون ربهم من فوقهم. يخافون ربهم من فوقهم. Actually in the book it's the rest of the verse is missing. They fear their Lord who is above them. من فوقهم. So that implies that Allah is above His creatures. And we have the well-known hadith in Sahih Muslim where the Prophet ﷺ asked a woman, where is Allah? And she said, Fi sama, in the heavens, above the heavens. Fi here means above the heavens. So we have textual evidence to indicate that Allah is not within His creatures. Therefore the implication of that verse, that Allah is closer than the jugular vein, the implication, the literal implication of it is not to be taken. Right? So this is the first point. Do we take it literally or don't we? We take it literally as a norm, automatically. But there are times when we will not take it literally. We'll go to the metaphorical or the symbolic, where the literal meaning contradicts other texts, which are the majority, describing Allah in a way contrary to those particular texts. Right? And actually, when you look at this verse in its context, it talks about Allah knows what the individual whispers in his heart, so it's already indicating that it's talking about knowledge and not actually Allah's essence, right? Usually the context will clarify it. The second issue that could be raised about the attributes in terms of how we perceive them is it possible to describe how that attribute is? Can we describe the hows about Allah's attributes? How? How is He all knowledgeable? No. How does he settle above his throne? Yes, the answer to that, as the brother said, is what Imam Malik had said when a man came to his circle and asked him, how does Allah settle above his throne? He said that settling in Arabic is known. It's known what it means. What was the second? How does that go again? والسؤال عنه بدعة. What's the الاستواء الكيف? Yeah, right. How he settles is unknown. Settling is known. The concept of settling is known. How Allah settles is unknown, majhul. And asking about it is bid'ah, is innovation. This was his response. So asking about the hows, how does Allah come down to the lowest heaven in the last third of the night? Well, if he comes down to the last third of the heaven, in the last heaven in the last third of the night, in India, right, at 3 o'clock. When 3 o'clock reaches here, he's coming down. When 3 o'clock reaches Egypt, he's coming down. And when 3 o'clock reaches Spain, he's coming down. And so on and so forth, going around the world. It means he's always coming down. So when is he up? We don't go there. The hows we don't get into. Allah informed us, we accept it. We don't go into the how. Because to go into the how, what does it imply? It implies here that we have understood Allah. We have now described Him in our own terms. Because when He said, if He comes down in India in the last third, 3 o'clock, an hour later He comes down here, an hour later He comes down in Egypt, who are we describing? Ourselves. That if you came down in India at that time and did here, at these different times, it means that you will always be coming down. But can we compare ourselves to Allah? No. So those who try to describe Allah or question the hows, how is it that Allah does this? Their inability to accept that He does it because they can't understand how He does it is an expression of their comparing Allah to His creatures. Because they're only able to perceive of Allah in terms of His creatures. Because if His creatures did that, then it would be this. This is what's happening. That's the rationale that is behind it. Somebody may say, well, what's the difference between that and saying that we cannot understand the Trinity? This is a how. Right? We can't understand the Trinity. This is beyond the human mind's capacity and ability to comprehend. So, you've ended up the same place that the Trinitarians have ended up. Because you can't explain how that is, you're just like them. What's the response to that? Assignment? Yeah, it's a good assignment.
Sorry.
Good idea.
What is the question?
The question is, what is the difference between us saying as Muslims in our creed that we don't describe the house of Allah, and the Christian saying we don't try to explain how Allah is three in one?
Trying to explain. Christians trying to explain.
Huh? No, we say,
And the Christians trying to
and the Christian saying
say.
the same thing. We cannot explain how Allah is three in one. It is beyond the human mind's capacity to understand. Right? It's important. These are important thinking points. Right?
Are there any particular texts you can find even?
He gives some hints to the
Hints. No, you've got the principles. The principles that you have so far from point number 1 to here, they're the principles that you apply to explain this. You use those principles to clarify this point. The third point, or third issue concerning the attributes is do the attributes of Allah resemble human characteristics? The basic answer is no, they don't, because Allah said لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, there is nothing similar to Him. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ, there is nothing similar to Him. No one is similar to Him. And this rejects the Christian Jewish idea in Genesis where God said that He would make a man in His image, and in the image of God He made Adam. In the image of God He made Adam. So as the Mormons concluded, God looks just like a man, but big, right? A big version, right? Huge, but He looks just like a man. That's what the Mormons believe. They call the Church of Christ and Latter-day Saints. You know, they're based in Utah, in America. And they have a book called the Book of Mormon. They claim that an angel by the name of Moroni revealed these new revelations in the 1800s to their founder, Joseph Smith. Right? That is their belief concerning God. He's a huge man. Okay, that completes the categories of rule number 3. We said that we would pause and allow you to ask some questions before going on to the remaining rule number 4.
What does it imply that during the last third hour He comes down? Okay, Allah comes down to the first heaven
and we say that he is even closer to a jugular vein, that he can listen, he has a knowledge of everything. What does it imply actually? He comes down to the first heaven.
The brother's question, what does Allah coming down to the first heaven imply? It implies closeness. Because in our minds, when we consider Allah as being above the seven heavens, that implies distance. Coming down to the first heaven implies closeness. But if we say, did Allah need to come down to the first heaven? No. Because whatever He needs, whatever He wishes to know about us, He can know without coming down to the first heaven. So this is only something done to bring in our minds Allah closer to us at that time of night, to give it a special significance. Because in the last third of the night, the greatest prayer that we can do after the obligatory prayers is tahajjud.
You take the obvious meaning that He says He comes down and He comes down.
Yeah, we take it as it is. As He states, we take it. How that is, we don't get into. But the fact that He said that with regards to the last third means that the last third is of most significance. If we have the chance, or if we're able, we should do it. I mean, this is what the implication is. Get up in the last third of the night and turn to God. That's the ultimate implication. That is one of the best times to pray. Why? Because it's the time when nobody is seeing you. It's a time, in general, because of course you could do it for people to see you too. Because people do gather in some masjids and, they do tahajjud in jama'ah. You have some movements and groups that do that. They require all their members to come Thursday night, whenever, to the masjid, and they make tahajjud in jama'ah. So it becomes something that people see. On one hand, it is an encouragement for people who maybe normally they would never do it. So there's a good element to that. On the other hand, it may have a negative element that people are doing it for show. Of course, that's the trial. Individual has to make a decision with regards to that. But in general, tahajjud is something between you and Allah. So getting up at that time, when there's nobody to watch you, etc., you're doing it purely for the sake of Allah. So obviously that prayer is going to have the greatest reward of any prayer that you do. Because the degree of reward in the prayer depends on the level of sincerity. This is what determines, is a prayer accepted or not? Bismillah wa salatu wa salam wa rasulillah. Did we have another question?
Should it be encouraged? Anything, whether it's Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, once a month, twice a month, for the sake of encouraging people to tahajjud. With regards to tahajjud.
Question: should tahajjud in jama'ah? Let's first ask the question: is tahajjud in jama'ah bid'ah?
Wasn't done by us, wasn't it? No, I think it was
Some of the companions
Yeah, the point is that it's not bid'ah, because there are recorded hadiths, authentic hadiths, that some of the companions who stayed with the Prophet ﷺ, they prayed, when he got up for tahajjud, they got up and prayed with him. So tahajjud in jama'ah is from the sunnah. It is from the sunnah. That if you, in your home, you have people staying with you or whatever, you get up for tahajjud, it's okay for them to join you, your family to join you in tahajjud. For you to wake them up to make tahajjud is okay. If they asked you, for example, please wake us up if you're going to get up for tahajjud, it's perfectly okay. Now, where you make a plan outside your home, in the masjid, for people to gather and make tahajjud, we can say that wasn't from the sunnah. That in and of itself wasn't from the sunnah. However, if we say that Taraweeh in Ramadan, Taraweeh is in fact tahajjud in Ramadan, where the companions did gather people in the masjid and they made tahajjud in the masjid. And we know that whatever is done in Ramadan actually is permissible outside of Ramadan. As a rite of worship, nothing is made halal in Ramadan which is haram outside of Ramadan. Now, some things which are halal outside of Ramadan are made haram during Ramadan. The opposite is true. Right? Food, sexual relations, etc. are halal outside of Ramadan, but during the time of fasting Ramadan they become haram. So, like Hajj, Ihram involves making certain halal things haram during a period of time for training purposes. Spiritual, emotional, psychological training. Spiritual training. But nothing is made halal in Hajj or in fasting or in any other act of worship which is haram outside of that act of worship. It's a general principle with regards to worship that you hold firm. And that's one of the arguments which was used by Sheikh Nasruddin Albani, for example, when he argued that covering the face is not obligatory. Because the Prophet ﷺ prohibited the wearing of niqab, for the woman to cover her face with any garment, unless it is, on a temporary basis as his wives did. That were it something, uncovering the face, were it something haram outside of Hajj, it would not have been made halal in Hajj. Because Hajj only makes haram what was halal, not halal what was haram, as with any other ibadah. That was just, you understand that line of reasoning, that was a line of reasoning used. So, tahajjud in jama'ah, we can say is permissible if one makes it on a fixed day, every month, every week. It's fixed. You join the jama'ah, you have to do it. You're obliged. Your pressure is put on you. You must be in the masjid. Now we're entering into bid'ah. Now we're entering into bid'ah. Where it is spontaneous, there's no problem. It's just like raising your hands in dua. Spontaneous, no problem. But once you fix it now, after your fard salah, you raise your hand in dua, now you have bid'ah. Where it's established as a consistent practice because of the fact that it wasn't done by the Prophet ﷺ and his companions. Though on some occasions he did raise his hands in dua. And he described a man, a traveler, raising his hands in dua. Were it not something good, he would not have given that description.
What does it imply? Raising hands?
Raising the hands in dua, what does it imply? It implies seeking help. It's a part of seeking help.
But without that also you can do it.
Yeah, you can make the dua without raising your hand. It's not a requirement. It's not an obligation.
So any specific reason why Prophet raised hands, raised hands at times?
Brother's question, is there any specific reason why the Prophet ﷺ raised his hands at certain times in dua? Not that I know of. Nothing specified. But we do know that the raising of the hands is something from childhood as an expression of reaching out. When the child wants the parents, what does he do? It's part of the reaching out. You're reaching out to Allah.
And he says it's also like begging Allah.
Yeah, like begging. Good point. Brother mentioned also. Who is it? At-Tirmidhi? Huh?
The upper hand is better than the lower hand.
No, but that's different. That's going this way. Right? But in begging, for example, when you beg, what do? You reach your hand, you put your hand out. Your hand's out. Help me. So there's implication of that in it. Further question?
Going back to the going down to heaven in the last part of the night. We know Allah is above and beyond the creation. But in that hadith, He's described as in going to the heaven. How do we explain that? Reconcile. We don't know. Without explaining the word how, but affirming that He is coming.
Okay, brother's asking, basically how? Without the how, how do we explain Allah coming down to the last third of the night? How do we reconcile Allah being above the heavens, above His creation, and coming down to in the last third of the night? How do we reconcile? Well, again, what's happening here? If you're above the house, you're on the roof of the house, and you come down to the first floor, what happens? You're now inside the house, and you're not above the house anymore. Right? So, when you ask, how do we reconcile? What you're in fact doing is comparing Allah to a human being who climbs down from the roof of the house and gets down to the first floor. Right? That's what you end up doing. Even though that may not be your intention, but that's what that question implies. What we accept is that Allah is above the heavens and not surrounded by His creation, meaning He's inside His creation. But at the same time, we accept that, as He said, He comes to the first heaven. I could give an example, but just in human terms, how it is possible to still be above and yet come to the first level. Okay, let me give an example. And we don't put this back to Allah. This is just for human beings. How even within the human realm we can do that. Right? It is possible to go inside of an anthill. An anthill, ants make a hill. And they're living inside there. They're below you. You're above it. Right? You could go inside of that anthill, reach inside, with a probe or with your hand or whatever, but you're still above. The anthill is still not above you. You're still above it. Okay? That's just as I said, in human terms, right? Which we're not going to, attribute to Allah, But I'm just saying, if we can conceive of it, even in human terms, it is possible to be above something and yet enter into that thing while still being above it. Then, of course, Allah is Lillahi al-Mathal al-A'la. In the greater sense, that Allah is possible. Yeah. Whatever, as our brother says, Allah wishes, is. So, what we're saying here, if one wanted to look into from interpretive perspective, is that Allah going to the first heaven doesn't necessarily mean that His essence enters into the first heaven and is then surrounded by the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh heaven, including His throne, which is above the seventh heaven. We don't conclude. To conclude that is to make Him similar to the man coming from the roof of the house and going to the first floor.
Sheikh, I had a question, but you'd already tackled it. I was just going to say that on the issue of Allah saying, "Laysa kamithlihi shay," and the Christians saying that that God created man in His own image. There is an ayat of Quran as well where Allah says that He created man. I think something about do not look at the bad of the people because Allah created them the way He wished, isn't it? Something like this, or when Allah talking about a woman, do not something like this. So this issue of Allah creating man in His own image, could that be applied to that verse that Allah created man the way He wished?
No, there's a verse that says about the angels creating, because the mushrikun are asking for Allah to bring down the angels, like humans.
No, I think there's a verse which says don't mock other people or something. The way Allah has created them, that's the way He's created them, something like this.
Well, get something specific and then we can come back and talk about it.
I have to find that verse.
Yeah, inshallah. Okay. Shall we go on now? Unless you have something specifically related. You have something specifically related? Go ahead.
About Allah's time. Is there any phrase existing in the English language that corresponds to the saying, like, for example, saying Bill Gates is working in Microsoft. Somebody would say, no, he is Microsoft. He owns Microsoft. He controls Microsoft. Is it appropriate? Can we use
Yes, that's a good example. And our brother brought a good example in English where we may say Bill Gates with regards to Microsoft. Somebody says, oh, Bill Gates works in Microsoft, and somebody else says, no, he is Microsoft. Implying that it's his. It belongs to him. We do use that, he is so and so, meaning that he is it is his property, it belongs to him. So this is a good example, very good. Okay, the last rule number 4. This deals with those people, is a general rule now, dealing with those people who deny Allah's names and attributes. As we began with a generality, Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen began with the general approach. How do we deal with the names and attributes mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah? Then we went into specifics of names and the rules concerning them, specifics of attributes and the rules concerning them, right? Then we came back at the end of all of that to the general rule again concerning names and attributes as a whole. How do we refute, or how do we respond to those people who deny Allah's names and attributes? Right? The general label that is given to them in Islamic theology is the Mu'attila. The Mu'attila. Mu'attila from ta'til. Ta'til means to stop something from functioning. To stop something from functioning. Mu'attila, they stop Allah's names and attributes from functioning. They deny their function. There is another group which they call the Mu'awwila. Those are the interpreters. The Mu'tazilites, or the Ash'arites, really the Mu'tazilites, they are the Mu'attila. They cancel the function. The Ash'arites, they explain away, give explanations for them. So for those who either cancel the names altogether or explain them away, how do we respond to them? How do we tackle their arguments? And one of the most popular writers currently on the internet, is Nuh Hamim Keller. He is an individual who promotes strongly this Ash'ari position of interpretation of sifat, and basically attack those who follow the quote-unquote Salafi position of as being anthropomorphists. That's the label that's put on those who take the texts as they are. You're labeled as an anthropomorphist, or in Arabic they call tamthil, from the mumathila. The response to those, Bismillah, salatu wassalam, Rasulullah, the response to those who either deny Allah's names and attributes or misinterpret them is from a number of different perspectives, basically 4 perspectives. The first, that their position of interpretation or denial contradicts the obvious meanings of the texts. Where they interpret, they end up giving meanings which are not those obviously implied by the text. So they're going against the obvious meaning. Good example of that is the Surah Taha verse 5, where Allah says, Ar-Rahman ala al-arsh istawa. The most merciful has settled above the throne. Istiwa, the settling above, was explained by the Mu'tazilites as being istila, which means taking possession of. But once you do that, you're implying that Allah was not in possession of it and He took possession of it. And that is not one of the meanings of istiwa. So the interpretations in general will contradict the obvious meanings of the text, or the most commonly used meanings of the text. Secondly, this process of interpretation and negation goes against the methodology of the early generation, about who the Prophet ﷺ had said, the best of generations is my generation, then those who follow them and those who follow them. So those are the best of generations. And if those interpretations are in contradiction to the early understanding, then it's not acceptable. They are the best to understand the religion and its texts. Thirdly, when they do the interpretations and explanations, they do so without reliable evidence. Either they play with the language, they take distant meanings, etc., or it is just from their own logic and reason. The third point was that they don't have authentic evidence, meaning they don't have Quranic support for what they're saying, or they don't have hadiths, authentic hadith to support it. They are going from their own reason, or they're using the language without looking at the other texts which support it, or they deny the texts which contradict their interpretation. The fourth principle of refutation is that whatever may be said concerning Allah's person may also be said concerning His attributes. Whatever is said concerning Allah's person, His dhat, can be said concerning His sifat, His attributes. Meaning that if you say that Allah is living, al-hayy, and those who don't interpret everything. They stop at certain points and say, is hayy, yes, He's living. He's a living God. In the same way that you can say He's living, and human beings also live, but you understand that His living is not like human living. It is eternal living, it's without beginning, without end, etc., etc., etc. The same thing can be said of any of the other attributes which are attributed to Him. Use the same principle used for those essential attributes for all attributes. Don't use one for some and then try to use something else for others. Because either you accept it in some cases, once you accept it in some cases, to now deny it in other cases is really pushing you in a position where you need to deny all. Because your principle should be consistent. Okay, that was the last of the rules, rule number 4. And inshallah, you have 2 assignments. The first of which was, first assignment was, just as a reminder before we close,
How is Allah merciful by putting people in hell? Yes.
how is Allah merciful by putting people in hell? And the second one was,
What is the difference between us, the Muslims, saying we don't destroy the house of Allah, and how the Christians say they cannot explain the Trinity?
okay, second assignment, what is the difference between us saying we don't describe Allah's house or the house about Allah, and the Christians saying we don't describe the house about Allah with regards to His Trinity, His state of being a Trinity. Okay? سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب